ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here with us, and we will start the panel discussion. Migration and why borders matter. This will be the key theme of tonight's discussion, and we are pleased to be hosted by the wonderful press club here. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bence Szabó, policy analyst at MCC Brussels, and it is my honor and privilege to be the chair of tonight's forum. Forum, as a term, is by no accident. MCC Brussels, ever since we kickstarted our new season in September, we tried to be at the forefront of promoting an open discussion and a free space for dialogues and exchange. And with this discussion tonight, we would like to follow the same format. And just to give you a quick reflection of the events that we had in September, MCC Brussels had a discussion about the political role of museums. We had a free speech colloquium and our very first day long conference on multiculturalism and Europe. What we truly strive towards is a democratic environment here in Brussels where every side can voice its opinion. And it is quite clear that today's discussion and the topic of today's discussion certainly has sparked a lot of opinions. Migration, as a term today, affects our moral judgments, our welfare, and the core values that we have here in Europe. Currently, we can see two visions of Europe, to be precise. One of an inclusive, integrative, global and open Europe, and a Europe of well-defined cultural, economic, and political borders. The free movement of goods, capital, services, and people have already been challenged by the war raging in the East, and this effect clearly signaled a clear border of where we assume Europe to end at. With a war in the Middle East and the protests in European capitals, we clearly see the cultural fundamentum of Europe being put to the test. The principles we live by in public and private affairs are now more multifaceted than ever. The question of who we are and what future we envision for Europe is now more difficult than ever. With that speech, I would say that we have quite a special lineup of speakers for you today. And once again, what we strive towards is discussion and dialogue. It's not just about our panelists speaking, because they will definitely have smart ideas to share, but we are also interested in your ideas, you, the audience, the people. With the spirit of open discussion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to quickly introduce you to the format of tonight's forum, just so we stay clear. In the initial stage, each of our panelists will have a short remark, and afterwards I will get to ask questions, moderating privileges, and afterwards we will yield the floor to the audience to have a bright conversation. So without further ado, please allow me to welcome our first speaker. She is a representative and a member of the European Parliament representing the Rassemblement National and the ID Group. Please welcome on the floor, Madame Patricia Chagnon.
Thank you so much, Professor Furedi, for inviting me this evening. Thank you so much for the whole team for inviting me to speak at your event. The subject of this evening, Why Borders Matter, takes on a very special meaning in the light of the current events. Hamas 4 days ago sent its soldiers into Israeli territory to commit atrocious attacks and terrorist assault against the Israeli population and other Westerners. The horrific news that continues coming out of Israel these past days is a cruel reminder that without borders, which are physical but also moral limits, civilization ceases to exist. Without limits, without borders, there is lawless chaos and savage barbarism. Radical Islam has yet again shown the world that it will never respect either physical nor moral borders in the quest for the Ummah, a global Islamic state. My heart goes out to the people of Israel. As an EU parliamentarian, I'm here today, and I'm very glad so that I can share with you my thoughts on the history of EU borders, their importance, the consequences of their dismantlement, and, well, where we go from here. While bordering has existed over millennia, how borders are conceived today and operated has changed considerably over time. Our present system is only 350 years old, a product of peace treaties drawn up after decades of European religious war. The Peace of Westphalia, signed in 1648, ended 30 and 80-year wars and created the framework for modern international relations. The concepts of state sovereignty, mediation between nations, diplomacy, find their origins in the text of this treaty that is well over 300 years old. Because of the Treaty of Westphalia, let's remember that the Netherlands gained independence from Spain, Sweden gained control of the Baltic, and France was acknowledged as a preeminent Western power. The power of the Holy Roman Empire was broken, and the German states were yet able again to determine the religions of their lands. Borders are as such of essence to the stability and peace between nation states because they define the legitimate territory in which a group of people have agreed on how they organize their society. Opposite these homogeneous populations and orderly defined borders of nation states, we have the heterogeneous populations and the fluctuant limits of empires. An empire, which I would resume as an extensive group, we have the example of Hamas or Hezbollah, of states or countries ruled over by a single ruler or oligarchy, which we will come back to, is I will talk about the EU. This heterogeneous supranational entity is centrally governed by a superior authority and is based on domination and power to exercise its domination on the people. It could be argued that there are two types of empires: the empire with unlimited appetite to expand, to push its borders as far as possible, to encompass new territories and submit new peoples to their centralized government. And the other is the kind of empire which is so vast that it is just preoccupied by maintaining stability within its borders. Well, regardless of the model of empire, their borders are not the natural limits of a population who have decided to make society together on a given territory. Their borders are artificially defined, encompass different populations, and this requires superior centralized authority to exercise control. Dismantling borders to dismantle national sovereignty. Well, it cannot be denied that the EU evolved firstly from an international organization, that is a space of cooperation between nation states, to a federal type of organization, but subsequently abandoned the notion of union and started a process of unification. By signing the Schengen Agreement on the 14th of June 1985, Belgium, Germany, France, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands agreed to gradually remove controls at their internal borders and to introduce freedom of movement for all nationals and goods of the signatory countries, other EU member states, and some other non-EU countries. Today, the EU has become an empire, a neoliberal post-national organization built around the no-border concept, run by powerful EU institutions with most disputable legitimacy, and decisions made by a centralized authority, the Commission. The EU has its own anthem, the Ode to Joy. It has its own currency, the euro. It has embassies. I just learned there were 146. Its own diplomatic force, and it refers to its inhabitants of nation states as European citizens, thus really ticking all the boxes that define the concept of an empire. In addition, the EU empire continues to expand. And let's take the following examples. Geographically, by inviting new member states to join. First in line, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Moldavia, go on, and even Turkey and Ukraine. Economically, by signing free trade agreements with countries on the other side of the globe, effectively tying them to economically to the European empire. And we can cite here the free trade agreements with Latin America, the Mercosur. Also, they're expanding legally by transferring more and more national competences to EU level. And an eloquent example of this is, for example, the competence of the migration policy, for which nation states have very little to say and has essentially been transferred to the EU. And this they can do by imposing supranational courts over national jurisdictions. And there is one less admittable way they expand. That's by using coercion and financial blackmail to bring recalcitrant countries and governments back into line. What are the consequences of this post-national EU empire on the citizens of the EU member states? Well, human beings are social beings that need a sense of belonging and that are naturally attached to their family, their community, and their country. In addition, European civilization is rooted in Christian values. The EU empire has consciously dismantled these. Their efforts have gone into making families redundant, people interchangeable, communities outdated, and countries obsolete. And well, if we need to mention God, they consider it as a concept of previous centuries. Now, I think that if you deprive people of those things in their lives that are bigger than themselves, family, country, and God, you morally disarm them. If you are deprived of belonging, why accept any sacrifice? Why fight, risk pain or death? And if you have lost your faith, what does it do to your moral standards and your sense of continuity? In France, we are a witness every day to the devastating effects of the so-called progressive ideologies and post-national EU policies. Mass migration, rising crime rates, declining birth rates, soaring energy prices, declining public services, gender issues, plummeting school levels, and the pauperization of our general population. That's a topic in itself. So, if we want to take back our control and the control from the oligarchy in Brussels and the neoliberal empire, we need to arm our people, and most of all our young people, with the strength they need to take charge of their future. And we must start by giving our people back their sense of belonging. The level at which we can act as politicians and decision makers, and because I'm a French politician, I need to express myself as being very attached to a secular model, and because I'm not the family of all people looking to belong somewhere, I need to know where I can act. It is our work to give them back within our possibilities, and our duty to give them back their countries which the EU stole from them. I would just like to make a slight comment on this, because it's really amazing to see the tens of thousands of Israelis living overseas traveling back at the moment to Israel since the attacks. Their sense of belonging is apparently very strong, and their sense of sacrifice for the country has remained. I close this short intermittence. No borders, I think, are one of the main reasons of our dislocated societies. Reinstating borders are the beginning of the answer to start rebuilding our nation states. A defined territory, a home country, defined by borders, the country where we belong, the country that will look after us, the safe haven from which we can start rebuilding the lives of our people and the future generations in Europe. I invite you all to rehabilitate borders and work together towards building the alliance of the sovereign nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your remarks, Madam Chagnon. And our next speaker is Head of Research for the Climate Policy Institute at the Mathias Corvinus Collegium. Please welcome Dr. Callum Nicholson.
Good evening. Hello, everyone. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to join the panel. So I'm going to try and give something which is probably quite a controversial thing to give, which is a very non-partisan view of migration here. I'm going to attempt it. But the first point to make, I think, is that obviously we live in very polarized times. On virtually every issue, there's a very strong polarity. If you just take the example, of course, of US politics, just as an illustration, which you all know, obviously in the States you have what you could loosely term sort of Trump right and the sort of woke left. Typically, though, what both sides are doing is seeing the other side as a disease and themselves as the cure. But actually, if you look at it, it's quite clear, at least to me, that both sides are symmetrical symptoms of perhaps a shared disease that is in need of a cure. So typically, the Trump right will look at the woke left and say their values are destroying America and vice versa. But actually, it seems to be, if you look at your sort of stereotyped average Trump voter, typically older, sort of working class, middle America, maybe used to work at a car plant. Look what's happened. A neoliberal economy has taken away their jobs, their dignity, and so it's not surprising that they're turning to someone who they feel will represent their interests because the establishment has failed them. So they are victims of a neoliberal system. But then you take your sort of stereotyped sort of woke person. They tend to be someone who's younger, maybe has a university degree, living in the coastal cities. But again, they themselves are also subject to the same system. If you're 25 now with a degree living in New York, and it can be elsewhere too, it's difficult to buy a house, to find a secure job, you have massive student debt, and because universities have been turned into sort of neoliberal businesses. And so what's interesting is both sides are suffering the privations of the same system, but interestingly, the system is telling them to hate each other, a type of divide and rule, served, of course, by algorithms on social media companies, which are driving polarity. And it's interesting, of course, that the social media companies do not charge us to use social media because we are not the consumer, we are the product. The consumer are the corporations who can sell our data or can rather buy our data in order to sell us things. So my point here is that I think often we misdiagnose our problems. There are these two groups that see each other as the cure, themselves as the cure, the opposition as a disease. I'd argue both as symmetrical symptoms of a shared disease that is in need of a cure. And I think when we look at migration, we see something similar, because when we look at migration, and for context, I mean, I used to study migration studies at the University of Oxford, which, as you can imagine, is a very sort of progressive left type of area of research. But what was really interesting is that if you look at the sort of more left-wing analysis of migration, their analysis tends to focus on economic factors, simply understanding migration quantitatively, making arguments which is backed up by the stats, that migrants tend to be younger and healthier, they tend to use the welfare state less, and indeed the health service less than the indigenous population if they come to, say, the UK, and that they often do jobs which are the 3Ds, dirty, demeaning, and dangerous, which local populations won't do. So there are a lot of these types of analysis that they have data to back it up, but what they fail to address is the cultural impact, the things that cannot be quantified, things that are more qualitative. We know that migration is changing culture. It's very hard to tell, to prove it in any data sort of sense, but we know it when we see it. But because you cannot quantify it, the more technocratic social sciences deny its existence. I suppose kind of like how in the sciences, it's very material driven because you can't quantify consciousness, so it's excluded from the sciences by analogy. But what's interesting that often migration from the left is framed as a cure. Then, of course, from the right, what we see is less an economic analysis to do with quantification, more a cultural analysis to do with qualitative elements. And in this context, migration is seen not as a cure, but as the disease to be cured, that it's changing culture. But I would suggest that, I just want to suggest here that migration, I think, is better understood as a symptom of a disease, which is in need of a cure. It's not itself necessarily the disease. Migration in the context of nation states has been pretty stable at about 3% of global population. Obviously, it's gone up in absolute terms, but it's always been about 3% of the global population are migrants. And it's, with one exception, actually, it jumped in 1991, not because there were more migrants per se, but because there were more borders, because the Soviet Union collapsed. And where there is variation, it largely goes up and down with the labor market. There's a very strong correlation. The point being here is that migration, as we understand it in a globalized world, seems to me more symptomatic of a global system that some may look at it and say, well, the problem is capitalism. It's a capitalist system. The notion of the need for labor is a very capitalist idea in this sense. But I would suggest it's not strictly capitalism that's the problem. I think it's probably the imperative of growth, of economic growth. It's worth noting the concept of economic growth as an imperative for every politician is quite a new phenomena. These days, if you're a politician and for your entire time in office, the economy is not growing, you're unlikely to get a second term. But economic growth was not something that would have featured as such a going concern until we could measure it, first of all. But if you go back far enough, for example, as best as economic historians can tell, between the year 1000 and 1500, Europe grew 82%. For context, that's how much that China grew between 2002 and 2008. Okay, so 500 years versus 6 or 7 years. The point is, economic growth is the exception, not the rule, historically. But if you look at economic growth, it correlates very closely with demographic growth as well, because for obvious reasons, they go closely together. Growth is built around various things, of course, as innovation, technology, and so on. But it very closely correlates with demographic growth. And what we're seeing is we've established a habit in the last 150 years of economic growth as the central imperative of anyone in power. But at the same time, of course, as we've learned, as populations grow, and the economy advances, populations do this. So they curve off. So the growth imperative remains, and increasingly there's a gap. And in the context of that gap, there's really two approaches to fill it. If you maintain the imperative of growth, you can approach it as the way that, say, Hungary is doing, saying they want a strong family policy to encourage people to have more children through tax cuts and so on for the more children you have. But then, of course, the other approach is to seek immigration and to say, well, we need more in the labor market. And of course, we see with Meloni in Italy, she ran on quite an anti-immigration platform. Faced with the reality of a depressed labor market, there was a need to have more immigrants coming in. So there's clearly this imperative of growth is the same regardless of the politics and the policy. There's always still this imperative of growth. My point on all this is that I think the problems we're facing when we look at migration, whatever your view is on migration, it's not really a technocratic issue in terms of the best policy. It's not even an ideological issue, meaning a political issue. It's an anthropological issue. It has an anthropological character, the challenge we're facing. It's this central imperative we have in our culture of growth. And as long as that remains in place, we're going to see symptoms like a demand for more migration. So to sort of wrap up on this, I kind of feel sometimes that when we think about social problems, we're still medieval. What do I mean? Okay, so in the early modern period, there was the biomedical revolution, where we understood the difference between a symptom and a pathology. So when the Black Death was there, people often confuse them. They look at the pustules and say, that's the disease. But of course, that's the symptom of the disease. We had to have a biomedical model, a proper epidemiology of the biological contagions among us. And when we did, we were able to handle disease. It seems to me that we're lacking in a epidemiological model of ideological contagion. We still confuse symptom and pathology. We are still medieval in how we think about ourselves rather than about the body. In terms of how we think about the body, we're modern. About the body politic, our instincts, I think, are still quite medieval. And it's interesting, when I mentioned epidemiology, if you look at the Greek origin of the word, it doesn't mean the study of disease as such. It translates literally as the study of what is upon the people. And what is upon the people can be ideological as much as biological contagion. And I think if we look across the spectrum right now, what we're seeing is pandemics of ideology. I'd even say pandemics of hubris and a lack of humility, of everyone being so convicted in their ideas that they are almost convicts of those beliefs, forgetting the fact that if you fight fire with fire, we end up with inferno. It doesn't really lead anywhere constructive. Hence the polarization we see. And so I think a lot of the way we look at our politics now, a lot of these political divisions, are not the solution that maybe each side think they are. Maybe they're part of the problem. Because what's missed in all of this is that ought does not imply can. Just because we think we ought to do something on one view or another doesn't mean we can do it. And as long as we're misdiagnosing the problem, whether we're saying migration is a cure or the disease, it is not a cure, it is not a disease. I would argue it's a symptom. So to finish up here, the title of this panel is Why Do Borders Matter? I'd say they do matter, but they don't matter for a moral reason. Whatever your view is on it politically, they matter simply because they are. They are the world we have. We live in a system of nation states with borders. And again, ought does not imply can. We can say borders ought to be or ought not to be. It's irrelevant. A moral discussion is completely irrelevant. I was in my hotel today, and it's very frustrating sometimes with British plugs on European things. And I thought, why don't they standardize it in a way that suits me? But then I think, of course, you couldn't do that because that's the system we've got. It's too complex now to change it. And if that's true for plugs, it's true for borders, that's for sure. So the reason borders matter is not because a moral argument for or against. It's simply because it is the world we have. That's why they matter. Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, I would like to call to the stage not the executive, because that implies something else, the executive director of MCC Brussels, and the author of the book Why Borders Matter, Why Humanity Must Relearn the Art of Drawing Boundaries, Professor Frank Furedi.
Right, so unlike Calum, I actually think that borders are a moral question. They're a profoundly moral question. And they've been a moral question ever since the Greeks, when they began to build walls around their city-states, and these walls served as a symbol of a community of people that were bound together by a common ideal. And democracy, the very ideal of democracy, which came to the fore in the Athenian era, could not have come about if there were no borders, there were no walls. So from the Greeks to the present day, borders do have a very important moral role to play. And I would argue that the reason why we have such huge problems is not for economic reasons. It's not the economic drivers one way or the other. It's not the political reasons, but rather the fact that within the West, particularly in the Anglo-American world, but also in France, Holland, and elsewhere, we've lost the language of morality. We are no longer able to give meaning to moral norms. And as a result of that, we've fundamentally find it very difficult to know where to draw a line. Now, knowing where to draw a line is important. As a father, I learned that unless I learn where to draw a line, I would lose my son. It's a very simple, very basic thing that even children need boundaries, never mind a collection of millions of people. And from the earliest point onwards, the drawing of lines or boundaries, because we're talking about not national borders, but boundaries, is a civilizational accomplishment. In fact, you can see civilization, the emergence, particularly Western civilization, but it's very similar in the Asian context. The civilization of societies evolves through a continuous drawing of lines. Where you draw a line has got a significance that is profoundly organic to the cultural imagination of a particular community. Now, I think what the problem is with immigration or migration, there's a lot of names we give to it now. I mean, at the moment, we don't talk about migrants because everybody seems to be an asylum seeker rather than just a migrant. What we have is a situation where the real problem, as far as I'm concerned, is not the migrant coming into a country. I mean, I myself, I was a migrant when I had to flee Hungary and went to Canada. It's not the migrant that's the problem. The problem always is the society into which a migrant goes to. A society that's got to make a decision about what it stands for. It's got to know what it means to be French. It's got to know what it means to be English. It's got to know what it means to be Dutch or German. And it's got to give that meaning, it is a meaning problem, a real cultural context. So that when people come into a society, they know that there is a French way of life, there's a German way of life, there's a British way of life to which they are expected to conform. And one of the things that has happened quite systematically in every Western European countries is that the elites of the society have completely refused to stand up for the values that they themselves were socialized into. The kind of cultural values that have been reproduced and transmitted through successive generations in these different nation states were something that they became estranged from. It was no longer that important for them. And the migrants could see, you know, if you go into England, which is the country I know best, if you go into England and you see that being English is not really important, that English people don't really know what it means to be English anymore, except when they go to a football match now and again, then what is it that you're getting drawn into? And if you haven't got something that you can assimilate to or to be drawn into, what you end up is a situation where migration leads inevitably to moral and social polarization, to the point at which any kind of solidarity, any kind of interaction between communities becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. And that's something that we see as being really, really important. Now, you might think that that's not that important, but you know, when I see asylum seekers in Greece on the island of Lapridos celebrating the fact that Hamas has just murdered young children in a kibbutz, thinking it's really wonderful that young babies had their throats cut. and jumping up and down with the scarves and everything else, then you know that if that's the case, that if these values that are being upheld by these individuals spread within our society, it does create a lot of mega problems for us in the future. And the reason for that is because if you haven't got a capacity to tell people that, you know, if you come into our society, these are the values you're meant to sign up to, then you're going to have trouble. Myself, I'm very open-minded about migration. I got no problems with migration. I have a huge problem with the failure of European societies to assimilate and the failure of societies to take borders seriously. That's a moral problem. Now, why is this a moral problem? I wasn't going to talk about moral problem, except Calum had just incited me to do that. The reason why it's a moral problem is because if you look around the world around us, if you look at the European world, you find that in our European world, there is not a single important civilizational boundary that's been created over the last 2 or 3 centuries that remains intact. Right? Every single distinction, every single boundary which has been important for European civilization is either being called into question or ignored. So the boundary between children and adults, which was fundamental, was foundational in every society, suddenly we hear about children's rights, but what we also have, and this is particularly pernicious in the Anglo-American, the Scandinavian world, what we also have is the adultification of children, where we sexualize children and recycle adult sexual obsessions with children. So you have the adultification of children on the one hand, and the infantilization of adults. You know, where 40-year-old guys are proud to wear T-shirts, you know, saying, "Oh, I wear the same T-shirt as my son. I'm really cool." That kind of complete inability to understand that there's a clear distinction between adults and children. So that's the first thing that goes. Well, of course, if the line between adults and children goes, then it's only a matter of time before the line between men and women go, right? I mean, why should we maintain, you know, what's the big deal? I mean, why should the biological distinction between men and women be taken seriously? It's so ambiguous, you know, we're so fluid. You know, what's the point of keeping these things separate? And you'll find that gradually, that kind of thousands of year old organic distinction between the sexes now becomes negotiable. But that's not where it ends. Because once you begin to call into question generational distinctions and between men and women, then it kind of goes on and on and on. So for example, we find that increasingly in our society, the distinction between the private and the public sphere, which is the foundation of democratic public life, which was absolutely crucial for creating a world where you could go into your private sphere, into your home, and knowing that, you know, as they say in England, an Englishman's home is his castle, all that becomes completely pulverized by a growing tendency to colonize the life of the people living in the private sphere, where increasingly the family is seen as a target of governments, where they can intervene with impunity and control and manage the way that people begin to live their lives. You have a situation where it's not just the private and the public sphere, but virtually everything else kind of goes, and obviously including national boundaries. I've just finished a book called not Why Borders Mattered, I finished with that one. It's called The War Against the Past, and the main thesis of my book is the erosion of the temporal distinction between the present and the past. And at the moment, with the decolonization movements, we seem to be very, very busy fixing the problems of the past. So all the injustices of the past become our main concern rather than dealing with the problems of the present. So there are problems. Well, most important of all, when you basically give up the drawing of lines, when you begin to give up boundaries and borders, you also give up the distinction between right and wrong. There used to be a time when there was a very clear distinction between right and wrong, when we used to say this is good and this is evil. There were very clear moral distinctions that were being drawn all of the time. And these moral distinctions played a really crucial role in the education of European societies, knowing what is right and what is wrong. These days, we have a very different approach towards this. You will know if you're a parent that your children will come back from school, and the children will come back from school with a report like this, and the teacher will say, little Johnny, did not that badly, but of course there is no such thing as a right and a wrong answer, right? And you do that in universities. Very often, as a sociologist, I was told, frankly, very, very harsh by saying this is wrong or this is wonderful. There is no such thing as a right and a wrong answer, and what we have is a situation where non-judgmentalism, not judging and being reluctant to judge, becomes deeply embedded in this. And I make all these points because when you look at every single domain of cultural experience and social experience, you will find that the same arguments are used to delegitimate borders as they are for national borders. I mean, that's the truth. So the hatred towards national borders, which in some quarters is extremely strong, is palpable in relation to the borders between men and women and elsewhere. So it is important to kind of reflect on this. I just want to end up by making what I think is, to me, a very important observation. Of course, you cannot do without borders. In the real world, you cannot do without borders, and even the most hostile individual who hates national borders will find some borders that they will worship. In the context of the Anglo-American world, they all love what they call safe spaces. I don't know if you've heard that in your society. They kind of draw safe spaces where people are protected from criticism or from the pressures of everyday life. And the people that kind of criticize Donald Trump for wanting to build a wall on the Mexican-American border are the same people that insist that they must have a safe space. They must have a safe space in order to kind of protect themselves. So they're aware of the fact that these distinctions are really quite important. But of course, life is more complicated than that. Because if you've gone about eroding the moral distinctions that we discussed, you also end up in a world that we live in today, where a lot of people who should know better in Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and London cannot make a moral distinction between the evil that is being perpetrated in the southern part of Israel and and take a stand against that evil in an unambiguous way. The number of times I hear a number of people saying that the murder of babies, or alternatively, the systematic killing of civilians, is really just simply a reaction to what Israel needed to get, that Israel asked for it in some shape or form, that somehow the murdering of those civilians is a just price to pay for whatever Israel might have done in the past, is bizarre, but it does indicate a lack of moral capacity to understand that there are some very foundational distinctions that need to be made. And I think that this situation is going to get worse in Europe, because as I'm talking here and as we're discussing, Hezbollah in the north of Israel has launched an attack on Israel, so they're being hit from both sides. And I think that in a world where we become so morally disoriented that we cannot make these kinds of distinctions, these kinds of conflicts are going to come back and haunt us here in Europe. And therefore, I think what Patricia was saying about the need for us to take control of our borders, to take them seriously, is a moral question in the first instance, because ultimately it means taking ourselves seriously. It means taking ourselves as citizens seriously, and it's being committed to a democratic way of life, where we basically argue that the people of a particular society committed to a particular set of values that is organic to their experience will get to decide what the future of their world is going to be like. Thank you.
I wish to say a huge thank you for our panelists. And the question that I would like to pose to you is, basically, we can see that even among nation states here in Europe, there are a lot of approaches to how we should handle migration. you can particularly see an East and West division, and you can obviously find historical reasons why some countries think about this issue differently, why other countries think about this differently. How can we create dialogue in this case? Because obviously the European Union is supposed to be this intermediary entity that can be the bridge in this dialogue, but we can clearly see that even on the EU level, we cannot properly find a common answer. So what is it that, for example, nation states should pay attention to when it comes to understanding this issue better and finding better solutions and better conclusions? Maybe Patricia.
Thank you. Thank you for the question, which is a very, very interesting question. Yes, first of all, before I answer this, I would like to say that commenting on Dr. Nicholson next to me, when he was saying it is less an economic problem for the right than a cultural problem, it is indeed also very much an economic problem in question. We cannot deny the fact that we have millions of unemployed people. I mean, Germany is saying they have to employ, they need immigrants because they need workers. Well, I regularly invite my German colleagues to come to France and get them there, because we have plenty of people to spare who could work in Germany. Now, what is the question? How can we create dialogue on immigration? Well, I think that is, we cannot create, it should not even be the objective to create dialogue. This is what the Immigration Pact attempts to do in saying to all the European nation states that we should have the same rules and the same objectives with regards to immigration. Now, of course, that is wrong. It depends on the country you have, and it depends on what you want for your country, how you deal with immigration. What Germany wants is totally different from what France wants with regards to immigration, or what Hungary wants with regards to immigration. So I think the first thing is that we need to accept that immigration policy is a national policy and cannot be one fits all for 27 member states. That is just outrageous. Secondly, there is a second problem which we must address, is that because we have Schengen and free movement of people within Schengen, we can also not say to Germany or to any other country, sorry for my German colleagues who I very dearly appreciate, but migration coming into Italy or in Spain cannot be treated only as an Italian or a Spanish issue, because as we see with Lampedusa, where we were just 2 weeks ago, the Lampedusa migrants, they are in Paris within 3 days because they just go through all the borders. So there is definitely an issue in saying we need to get those national borders back to be able to have the immigration policies that each and one of our nation state countries wants.
Maybe Frank, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I agree with that, but I think the key thing is dialogue between who? Because it seems to me that the principal focus of the dialogue should be the people. And at the moment, the voices of ordinary people on the issue of migration is never heard. Because I don't know about you, but when I travel around Europe, even in Germany, you'll find that a significant section of German society is extremely wary of the kind of immigration policy that's been imposed on them. I know, for example, people feel that the migration policy is not something that they have signed up to. It's not like as if they've been consulted. So there is no dialogue. And the trouble is that the minute you want to have a debate or a discussion on migration, somebody from the European Commission or a Eurocrat will accuse you of being a racist. And that's the typical answer you get. So you will say, oh yes, let's have a discussion, let's have a debate on the issue of migration, how it should unfold. That will immediately be seen as a sign that somehow you're xenophobic or suffer from some other kind of pathology. So dialogue, I think, in migration is very difficult, because the only migration that's worth having is not really allowed at the moment, and that's the migration that's the discussion that we're having amongst our own people. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, in Poland, they're having a referendum on migration to coincide with the elections that are coming up. That's not a bad idea. I think a referendum to hear what people think on the migration issue is really a useful one. But I should just say that national policies are really important, and that certainly for Central European countries like Hungary or Poland or Slovakia, which have very little experience of colonialism, in fact, no experience at all of colonialism, and which have lost their independence for a very, very long time, and have only regained it since regime change. I think it's entirely understandable that these countries are wary of opening up their borders to anybody, because every time they open up their borders in the past, historically, they've been conquered and overtaken and they lost their independence. So I think we have to be very careful to make distinctions about what is appropriate in different parts of Europe.
So just to comment on I actually agree with you with the specifics of saying that the right concerned about economic issues too, and there's an important point in that, I think, which migration is something to be understood like everything really in the particular, not the general, and that there are variations depending on context. Of course, there are jobs, of course, in certain contexts which native populations won't do. During the 2008 crisis and the financial crisis, Brits would not do jobs like cleaning the tube. Immigrants would do it, but Brits who are unemployed would not do it. And so there's exceptions, but the point is it needs to be understood in the particular. And I think it's something Frank was saying about the problem is not migration, it's society. I've always thought of migration by analogy as like the eye of a storm. That if you look at a storm, a hurricane, the eye is actually very calm. Everything that does the destruction is whirling around the eye. In a sense, migrants are just people, but the way that they're actually engaged with by society or society's understandings of itself, all the politics around it is a thing that actually proves destructive, how these things are narrated, I suppose. But this leads really, I think, to the important point about how the solutions with the lack of dialogue is that, again, I think a lot of these big institutions like the EU and in the world in general, they default to the general, not the specific, not the particular. And I think one of the failures we have is a failure of empathy, and actually not just simply empathy. I mean, more almost humility, the humility to understand that even if someone else believes something and you believe them to be delusional or wrong, they still believe it. And they have to be accepted on those terms. It's kind of back to my borders point, that borders matter, not my view because they're a moral reason, but simply because they are what we have. And I actually think there is a moral obligation to accept the world as it is. I think it is still a moral position. But the same applies to how people view migration, that people think of these things differently. And if we don't engage with those and try and understand them, then we're not going to get anywhere. And the crucial point in all this, the dirty word today that everyone hates is compromise. Compromise is not where everyone gets what they want, it's where everyone doesn't. That's precisely what compromise is. Anyone knows this in a personal relationship. A real good solution is where everyone leaves the room a bit grumpy. That's actually quite a healthy relationship. It's not where one person thinks they got everything. And I think we have a phobia of compromise now for some reason. But Europe was built on compromise, and we're losing that now because of this tyranny of generalization, of abstraction. And I think we need to get back to understanding the world in the particularity of its reality, because abstractions are ideals, they're not real.
Can I just come in a little bit? I think compromise is an interesting concept because compromise works really well. For example, if you're a trade unionist, you went on strike for 15% more in terms of your wages, and you sit down and you have a debate and discussion and you strike and you eventually come to 7%. And as Calum says, both sides are really grumpy under those circumstances. And certainly in the economic domain, when you have distributional struggles, compromise is possible. I think it's very difficult to compromise over national sovereignty, because you cannot have national sovereignty on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, but on Thursday, Friday, you open your borders to anybody that moves, right? What happens under those circumstances is that the possibility of compromise actually leads to some very difficult results. I think when you come to the domain of values, and when you come into the domain where moral norms kick in, it's very difficult, because when you have strong views about what is right and what is wrong, finding a middle ground doesn't just make you grumpy. Finding a middle ground actually means that both sides, in a sense, betray something quite foundational, what they're really all about, which is why whenever you have a culture war, when you have kind of cultural conflicts, they don't get resolved. The only way they get resolved is by the ideal of tolerance, which was an ideal that was developed after the religious wars in Europe. So my position on compromise is no compromise, no surrender. When it comes to value-related issues, certainly I would never surrender. Perfectly okay to compromise on distributional issues and those kind of specific economic and narrow political ones, but it's precisely because our elites have been so willing and so committed to compromise everything that their kind of nation and their society has stood for, that I think we got the big problems that we have within our midst in Western Europe.
Guys, that's a very quick thing. I mean, at a certain level, I suppose I'd agree with Frank actually, and I think at a certain point, I think the EU would have done well to have more room for people being uncompromising. This a bit more space again for sovereignty. I do think that's probably a compromise that should have been made, but that would have been a compromise maybe from the EU's perspective.
Yeah. Well, yeah, very interesting, Frank. I always, as usual, I smile when I hear you when I hear you talk about developing your concepts, which are always very interesting. I would like to come back on the EU and that new pact for immigration and asylum, and just a notion that we've sort of passed through really quickly, is the intentional confusion that has been installed in the minds of people between an asylum seeker and an economic migrant. This has been totally confused, and now everybody is an asylum seeker, which they are not. Asylum was invented for people being persecuted for their religion, for their political opinions, and has now been totally abused in saying everybody who thinks they should move because, I don't know, they can be wealthier in Europe, or, you know, good on them. And I would probably do the same if I could find a better future, but it is up to us to decide how we're going to deal with this. The African population is going through a demographic explosion, and if you look at the numbers which were published by the University of Amsterdam by a study done by Jan van der Beek, and it's just come out in English, and I will give you an economic study on immigration. It's called The Impact, the Advantages and Disadvantages of Immigration. It addresses all kinds of issues. And he mentioned, one of the things he mentioned was just the sheer numbers of people wanting to leave the African continent and come to Europe. So even if we only accept 5%, it will still be impossible. So that is a really important issue. Now, I'll try not to be very long. The new pact for asylum and immigration has, what I said, purposely faded the lines between asylum seekers and economic migrants. Not only that, it is based on what the Commission says to us, entire compromise between, of course, the decision makers who are not the elected people by, not elected by their people. And what is happening is that it totally undermines any sovereignty of any nation state to act as they want. What I think we should be doing is looking at Denmark. Denmark is a member of the EU, and Denmark has totally been able to control migration and taken back its grip on how they treat immigration and asylum there. Now, I don't hear Denmark being drawn in front of any courts saying that they don't respect human rights or what have you. All is going very well in Denmark. And they, at the time, had an opt-out option on certain directives of the EU. And I think this is what we need to get back to. We need to fight to get that sovereignty back, so that we can decide, the French people can vote for a party to decide. I will conclude on the last thing. They have made it impossible for people through voting to sanction policies of their national leaders. In France, Macron will go and say, oh, I can't do this, the EU has decided it. You can vote for me, I'm the best, I will fight to represent you, but, really can't do anything about it, this is the EU. And when it's the EU imposing things on the French people through the legislation, they'll throw the arms up in the air and say, oh, yeah, but that's it, we decided to be 27 together, and that's just the way the cookie crumbles with, green deals and what have you. So it's taken democracy away in the fact that as people in a nation state. You cannot even vote. People can't even vote for their leaders and sanction them on policies because they can't see the link between what they are, they're using the system to always throw the hot potato to the other one. So I think that's a very, very important issue that we need to address. People need to know that the EU is imposing these rules and their national leaders are not doing anything about it. We have the example of very courageous countries like Hungary and Poland who are. We have the example of Denmark, who has never entered into that. And that's what we should really be getting back to, I think.
And with that point said, I would like to yield the floor to the audience. So I would kindly ask our colleagues to deliver the microphones who wish to speak, and feel free to state your questions. Gather some of them. Gentleman here in the front.
Thank you. My name is Chris Wensing. I'm one of the co-authors of the not so famous book Regionalizing Eurasia, where we also get into migration issues. I have two questions, if I may. One, in any case, for the whole panel, and perhaps the other bit more for Dr. Nicholson. First question is about the internal migration within the EU, which is rather large, even compared to migration from third countries. And internal migration in the EU, in any case, punches quite big holes in, especially the countries that are the sender countries in Eastern Europe, South Europe, and so forth. So perhaps a reaction on that. How should we deal with that? Second question is that Professor Nicholson, you mentioned that at some point the economic growth sort of evens out. And also, evens out, whereas the expectation continues of growth, but also population growth peters out, or even populations start to decline, which is what we see now. So one would expect that we should look for a bit of a equilibrium. So an equilibrium in terms of sort of the size of the economy, and equilibrium in terms of the size of population. How should we address that? Thank you.
I mean, you were approached first, Calum. I just wanted to touch on this.
Sure, do you want me to? Okay.
Yeah.
So just on the point that was to me, yeah. So what I said was the imperative of economic growth became a cultural norm mid to late 19th century, give or take, depending on which country. That's maintained the habit we have culturally, but it was closely correlated with demographic growth, which has begun to curve off. But we still have the political incentive to grow, and so there's the gap there. In terms of solutions for that, I don't know what the solution is, but I think we need to, my point is we need to diagnose the illness before you cure it. And right now, we all know this, when we're all sick, you know, it's not enough to know you're sick. You need to know what's making you sick to cure it. And I think at the moment, we are often misdiagnosing the problem, meaning we're not going to cure anything. So I don't have any solutions, but that was my general point. Very quickly on the point, I think you were saying one of the problems is internal immigration, and there's brain drain from, say, Romania and so on, or even Hungary, actually. A lot of the most well-educated Hungarians are going. They're going to Germany or the UK, or maybe before the UK, but not now. And the so this is something that I think isn't really talked about enough, that we often think about migration in the context of immigration, the effect it has on receiving countries. But the other side of migration is emigration and the effect it has on sending countries. The data on that's very ambiguous, actually, because emigration can lead to, of course, brain drain, where the best doctors leave India, for instance, and go to the UK. But also there's the argument that once they get to the UK, they're sending money home, remitting home, which drives local economies and so on. And it's very difficult with migration to ever come down on a sense of what the truth is. And indeed, there's a whole area of migration studies interested in migration theory, theorizing what pushes and pulls migration. Is it good or bad? All migration theory, all migration studies is really about a simple question. Is migration good or bad? You know, for the home country, the receiving country, or the migrants themselves. I don't think there are any answers. And I think the reason is that we're not strictly talking about migration in isolation. You cannot talk about migration without talking about political economy. It's a factor within that, one of many. And whenever people isolate migration analytically, I think they fail to find the answers they're looking for, not because they don't have enough data, but because they're asking the wrong questions. It's not the right frame of reference. So I agree, there is an issue of people leaving. The ultimate impact on that depends on so many factors. To come back to the point, the specific matters, not the general. There is no general answer to that question. It has to be understood in particular context.
Yeah, on political economy, which is really important, and I hope that MCC Brussels will be doing a lot more work on political economy. It's really important to realize that it's a bit of a myth to see a direct correlation between democracy and economic growth and economic development. There are some indirect links with this, but in general, the problem that's facing European societies is precisely that countries like Germany and Britain and France are relying on cheap labor as a substitute for raising productivity. And the way you raise productivity, in other words, which is the main driver of economic growth, is by technological innovation and investing in industry. And if you look at the levels of industrial investment in European societies, especially since 2008, but even before that, it's been flat. In places like Italy, it's been flat for an even longer period of time. So when you have a reluctance to innovate and invest in technology and to raise productivity through technological means, but rely on cheap labor as a way of sustaining your economy, you are going to have two big problems. One is that you're relying entirely on cheap labor, which will then lower the wages of other workers that are already there within that society. But secondly, it will mean that it leads to an economic stagnation, which is one of the problems that we're confronted with. But the economic stagnation that many parts of Europe are experiencing are not due to, not due to demography. They got everything to do with the inability of European capitalist society at the moment to take its domestic economic sort of situation seriously, and the governments to make long-term investments in infrastructure and in new technology, which is the only way that these issues will be solved in the long run. So I think that that's a subject that's important in and of itself, and probably for me the best argument against migration is the fact that by using migrants in this kind of way of basically using them as cheap labor actually prevents Europe from actually having an economic renaissance, the kind of economic growth and renaissance that it needs. And that's something that we need to confront in every European nation.
Would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, just very shortly. Yeah, I find it a very interesting question, Krista, when you asked about the effects on countries, departing countries with regards to migration. And that also goes for African countries, of course, the question of brain drain. And it's a question that I think should be also seen in the light of departing countries. Like we have the issue now in France. We've got doctors leaving France because the salaries are so low, and nurses leaving to Switzerland because the salaries are so low in France. We are experiencing in France a departure of our educated young people because they gain better wages abroad. The question is then, in what sense is it fair for society to pay for their education, and then them entering a capitalist system in another country to make big wages? I can understand that in the sense of America. If you have to contract a very important loan for your studies, well, then it's up to you where you're going to then earn your money to pay back your loan. But it's a bit different in the situation of a country like France, where the society pays for education and people are going away. But of course, that's a question also in Africa. Countries of destination need to have their own policies on that. I think it's really important. We come again back to the point of sovereignty. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with inter-European immigration is a question of sovereignty. I just would like to suggest a book. because there is a fabulous book which you guys must all read by Paul Berrock, which is The Myths and Paradoxes of Modern Economy. And I think it touches on the subjects which you were touching on innovation and growth of economies without forcibly trying to attend to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and how that actually might I reread it over Christmas when I was sitting. I reread it. It was many years ago I read his book, and it really shows that maybe globalization is not the answer, and it is a very different answer that he's suggesting in his book.
Thank you very much for it. Moving on to the questions, then the lady first here and the gentleman next to her.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. My name is Patricia. I would like to ask a question. First of all, for me, the question in immigration issues is if it is forced or if it is chosen. If it is forced, it is the symptom that we heard before. So it needs some treatment. The second point is how many people are moving, because I cannot invite 50 people to my flat. We don't fit in, so we cannot have fun together. So it's the point of quantity. And my question, thinking of all this, is do you know of any country who takes seriously migration policies? Because if I take up French lessons, I'm new here, so I cannot pretend to talk French through my Spanish grammar or to go to class in jogging clothes. So I need to adapt somehow. So I have always wondered, when you go to a place, I mean, what are your expectations? You should respect the laws and the customs there without renouncing to your own identity. So, and this is not globalization. Sometimes you need to move to another place, but you are still your own feature. So,
Moving on to the gentleman.
Yes, Nicholas Fest, AFD Germany. I have a question to Mr. Nicholson. You mentioned that there are, it's debatable whether migration is positive or negative for a country, but as far as I know, there are at least a dozen or probably even 100 studies from universities in Berlin, in Amsterdam, and Sweden that all dealt with this matter, and they all came to the same conclusion that migration is, let's say, not very favorable to the receiving country, but sometimes favorable to the country that where the people come from. And so, I mean, we have all these reports on Sweden and so on, and of course, in Germany we see how much money we spent on the people who came in during the last 10 years, and it's much more than they repay in form of taxes and so on. So I really wonder why this is, or why you said that this is still debatable. I mean, even the UN commissioner in charge for migration just recently said, no, we must accept that migration is in most cases unfavorable, and he couldn't name a single case where this has been favorable. Probably, after the Second World War, it was a bit different. But today, and of course, in the medieval times and so, but today, I mean, if non-educated people come in large numbers to countries with a very where the demand for well-educated people is high, otherwise you don't find a job. I really wonder why, how you can explain that migration in our times is, at least for Western European countries, could be a favorable thing. Thank you.
And then moving on to the gentleman in the red/pink suit.
My question is to Mr. Nicholas, correct? You used the metaphor "eye of the storm," and it puts all the responsibility on the nation taking in the immigrants. And I think an important thing to point out is you're talking about policies around them. I suppose you're referring to how we treat them in society. But the people, for example, that came to Europe and now are celebrating their terror attacks and Hamas, they have these views instilled by their own country, by their own beliefs, and we can't easily change that. So then maybe the problem are the immigrants coming with themselves with those views, and not how we treat them when we take them in.
Okay, so Callum, please.
I'm sorry for all the questions. Both those are kind of the same answer, really. But I think that my point was when people try and say what is the nature of immigration in some general sense, as if there's some universal theory, that's a flawed approach. It always has to be understood in context. So I'd agree with you. Migration can be good or bad in particular contexts. It can be welcome or unwelcome. It can cause different types of problems. But the point is, if someone is trying to seek some general view of migration, all types of migration, which it may sound like I'm building up a straw man, but often a lot of migration studies is built around this idea that there is some theory of what pushes or pulls migration, but it needs to be understood in context. And so you say you can think of no good examples of immigrants bringing anything good, but my family were migrants, moved from England to Canada. The Canadians liked what my dad was doing. It wasn't a problem. It all depends on context. It depends on which country, which culture, and so on. My point is to say that blanket statements around these things are unhelpful. I'd even say with the people celebrating Hamas, of course there are people doing that, but in any group of people, there's always going to be one prick saying something stupid. That's how life is. It doesn't mean everyone is saying that. It doesn't mean all Arabs are celebrating what's happening in Israel. I'm not saying people are not celebrating Hamas, but as soon as we fall into this generality of thinking it applies to everyone, I think it's a non-starter. I mean, it's just not. I've never had any experience of life where everyone thinks the same thing. I mean, in this room here, there's probably a lot of shared frames of reference among everyone in this room, but I'm pretty sure we'd all ultimately say quite different things. That's not a fault. It's a feature of being human. Humans are plural. And I think that so that would be kind of my point on that. And with regard to, I had something to say, but I can't remember what it was now. I don't want to take up too much time. So.
Yeah,
Countries taking it seriously, taking immigration seriously.
I think it's important to realize, I mean, I was involved in a study after 9/11, after the World Trade Center was destroyed, and a bunch of sociologists was asked by NATO to try to understand why it was that large sections of Muslim society in Europe tended to think that was a really good thing, pretty much in the way they tend to think that it's really good what's happening in the kibbutzes of southern Israel. And so we did a study. I focused on young Muslim kids in England, which we interviewed and we talked to them and everything else. And in the course of doing these interviews, it became very, 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 very clear to me that the main problem was the fact that when you talk to them about, what are you doing here? What do you think about Britain? What do you think about a number of political questions? They basically said that the reason why they became attracted towards a radical Islamic position was because it actually said something to them, whereas British society gave them no answers to anything. It made no demands on them whatsoever. That, as far as they were concerned, British society was ashamed of being British. It wasn't something that had a compelling narrative. And I think that kind of sentiment, that kind of reaction is entirely understandable. So when I wrote up the report about radicalization that was occurring, I made the point that actually until British society had more confidence in its own way of life, it will always repel many people that were coming in there rather than attract them, particularly when people were looking for an answer. And certainly a lot of the young Muslim kids were naturally looking for an answer. So we have to, I think, always come back to the fact that the problem lies within ourselves. And there's a danger of externalizing the failure of the West to get its act together by recycling it on the people who are calling it out, which are often the immigrants. I mean, having said that, you don't need to have a PhD in cultural studies to know that if you import people who are committed to a particular way of life, when they come into a different society where there is no commitment that's expected, those values are going to be hegemonic as far as they are. and they're going to compete. So you saw that in Brussels. I mean, I'm a football fanatic, and I remember going. I'm going into a Moroccan cafe to watch Morocco play. I think I could have been Belgium. I'm not sure what the team was, and I realized that I shouldn't be there because everybody looked at me as if I was like a secret policeman or something. But I thought it was very interesting because the spontaneous outburst of rioting that occurred afterwards, it was entirely natural. Spontaneous outburst of rioting was something that came naturally to everybody in that milieu. It wasn't something that they had to somehow study and learn. It came naturally from the fact that their culture and their way of life has never been challenged and has a complete possibility of developing in isolation from any other kind of influences. And that's the terrain, the cultural terrain that we're dealing with. And we have to, until we solve that problem, the issue of migration will always create very, very thorny, difficult issues for us.
And Madame Chagnon.
Yeah, I would like to come back to your question, which I think you actually answered yourself about adapting and respecting when, as an immigrant, you as a Spanish person come to Belgium, or I as a Dutch citizen became French, right? I was born in the Netherlands. It is all a question of numbers. It is all a question of numbers. If communities remain very small and are culturally related, integration is very easy. If communities become too big, they start living by themselves, they live on the periphery of the country they've integrated, and it doesn't work. And France is the crying example of how immigration policy failed. There is a parallel society in France because France has been incapable, unwilling, not foreseeable. Let's not judge that, but the reality is we have two parallel societies in France. Now, why are we letting this continue? I think that's very important too. I think that has to do with what I talked about before, is the moral dismantling of the people. We are not proud enough of our culture to say, well, now we stop, and this is the way it happens because we are in France. But we must also realize, and this is the object of a book I'm shortly to publish, is the tremendous increase of the power of radical Islam on Muslim populations, not only in Europe, but equally in the Muslim and the non-Muslim world. I mean, look at Indonesia. Indonesia 30 years ago was a totally different place than it is today. So I think that is very important. We have seen, and that is partly the fault of the West, and it's partly the fault of those progressive and highly the fault of progressive ideas. We have let radical Islam take over totally in the West and in other countries. They did this on a very, it'll be the object of another talk, but I think we have that. We have a moral disarmament of our populations. They don't feel proud of our culture. And we have a total dominant growing religion and philosophy, which is radical Islam.
Moving on to the next second round of questions. The gentleman at the back. Behind.
Yes, John Weber. I'm used to be Dutch. Now I'm Swiss. And we have 20 in Switzerland. We have 27% foreigners, expats in port. And in Zurich, for example, 69%. And we have no problems with that due to the fact that the Swiss are keeping their identity, are very strict about what they want. So I think that, as you said on the panel, my question is, why are other European countries not following that? And by the way, we don't keep them. So we kick them all out. There's only 3% staying there till their pension.
I mean, if I turn the question to you, gentlemen, I mean, it's curiosity for me as well. What do you think gives the Swiss identity such strength to keep its integrity and stay together?
I think that the Swiss are very conservative, first of all. Even the left, the left wing, the SP, the socialist, they are much righter as all the other social groups in Europe. And due to the fact that they have a very tight community, that they are keeping their traditions very strong. Only recently, in the bigger cities, they are going to be more wokenized, let us say, by the import of the rest. So the cities are quite European equally, but the majority is not living in the cities, luckily. So they keep the Swiss traditions in place.
Thank you. The question will still stand. We move on to the gentleman here.
So
Just to give more voice.
now my question was really going to be, in terms of the post-war period, certainly the last 60 years, can we think of a single example where migration has been favorable to the host country? I suspect not, but maybe we've just heard one, namely Switzerland, where at least it did not have a highly detrimental effect. But then, of course, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why? And here, the Swiss case may reveal some very uncomfortable truths, namely that the migration Switzerland's been witnessing is not primarily driven by a kind of helper's syndrome, but perhaps to a considerable extent by the opposite. So let's leave aside the Swiss example, and I'm curious to learn whether, apart from it, anyone can think of any example where migration has had beneficial, let's be more specific, economic, social, or political effects.
Thank you. And the gentleman at the back wanted to ask a question. And afterwards, my mic doesn't seem to work. I'm still loud enough. That's good. So basically, before you ask your question, ask it freely. Please give the answer, and then we will conclude. And we kindly invite you to the reception to engage in more fierce debates, possibly.
Yes. Well, if you don't mind, I may make a comment actually instead of a question. Many people disguise comments as questions. I'm the worst of them, but I'm putting an end to it as a part of a New Year's resolution. My general point that I would like to make is that we've heard a lot of arguments around the migration debate. Very often we enter into the economic one, the one about values, the one about crime levels. We also hear, I was very interested to hear more moral arguments and debates and philosophical ones about migration. We ask ourselves, what does it mean to be Irish? What does it mean to be Belgian? What does it mean to be German? And I find that all these debates, unfortunately, kind of obfuscate around one key principle, which we really must, I believe, if we are against mass migration, at least, maybe other people here are different, but if we are against mass migration, we must focus wholly on a principle, which is that a people, if they have a right over who they allow in and possibly over who they allow out of their community, and that may not even be necessarily ethno-linguistic or national, perhaps even religious groups, but a people have a right to say no to migration. Because I'll actually end on a little rhetorical question, which is, I would ask, let's say, hypothetically, Martians could come here as migrants. Would we or would we not have the right to say no to them, even if they objectively were going to improve the society in every metric and there was going to be no harm?
I mean, there were very serious questions asked, but I would really touch upon this Martian. Would we integrate them?
It's a real
I leave it up to
illegal
you.
aliens. Yeah. Do you want to go?
I've got a soft spot for Martians. So I probably did my number 2 favorite migrants, coming in. I think otherwise I would like to see a lot of Hungarians coming in, because it would improve the quality of food tremendously, within our society. But more seriously, I think we had a number of very interesting points. It is important to see things in context, because there are examples of where migration has positive benefits. For example, in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, in the post-war period, these are large settler sort of societies where there's a lot of room and a lot of potential for those migrants to make an incredible contribution. I think within the European context, you can argue that at certain moments in certain places, migration had some benefits. For example, a lot of people in Britain argued that the National Health Service could not have survived without immigrants coming into it. It's a debatable point. But I think the issue for me is not whether migrants had a positive benefit or a negative benefit in economic or political terms. The key issue for us that we got to come back to time and time again is who decides. It's always who decides. And I think that the fact of the matter is that if people do not get a chance to decide, if they haven't got a say over who comes into their towns and to their communities, they will feel dispossessed and alienated. And they will feel as if they've been trapped in their own society, but their society no longer looks like what it did beforehand. And the tragedy is that in many, many places, especially after deindustrialization, you have large sections of the European working class who, in places like Pas-de-Calais or in places like in the north of England, who have simply have felt that their world has gone, the carpet has been pulled under their feet, and they see migration and immigration as partially responsible. Whether that's true or not doesn't really matter, but the point is that once their world changes, because they have not been consulted about this new world that's kind of coming in, then that kind of annihilates their very being. And that's what has created a tremendous amount of problems in Europe, where people have become alienated and estranged from their own societies. And that's a massive socioeconomic, but also a cultural problem that's getting worse and worse and worse, because we now have several generations of working class people who have not had a proper job, who see no future for themselves. So I think in that sense, we have to make the judgment that this kind of migration is a disaster for European society.
Callum, if you would say your concluding remarks.
Sure. Just quickly on the question, is migration favorable? I mean, I really think, again, it's how you break this sort of question down. I mean, are we talking about it economically or culturally or socially? In terms of purely economically, which nation are we talking about? Are we talking about Polish plumbers or people coming from India, or is it, or educational background? Are we talking about the software consultants or people who work at the NHS or laborers? It really depends on context. I mean, again, in the UK, even when there was a financial crisis, native Brits would not go do jobs in agriculture and cleaning and so on, but immigrants would. And so there was kind of there's that element. Also, Polish plumbers, is it good or bad? Well, it's really good if you want the plumbing done, because it's cheaper and probably, frankly, done better. But it's bad for the English plumbers because there's competition. So the question is it favorable? I don't think we can generalize. As soon as we start seeing migration as a group category, instead of breaking it down by different contexts, I'm not sure how analytically useful any statement about it is. I'd also say something about the class element that Frank raised. One of the things I've seen on the left in the UK is what I call ideological gentrification. So middle class sort of moral panics have taken over the left. It used to represent class interests. It absolutely does not now. It represents basically cosmopolitan Islington middle class people. I grew up partly near Whitehaven in the north of England. And people in Whitehaven, the most impoverished, the people with the least opportunities and get no sympathy from anyone are young working class lads from places like Whitehaven. No one cares about them. And so what's happened to the left on that? And the final point I make about, you mentioned Switzerland and why don't people follow Switzerland's view? The question is less why is Switzerland doing it well? It's why have other countries, particularly neoliberal countries, particularly ones in the Anglosphere, why have we lost that sort of small c conservatism, that appreciation of community, of recognizing that there are why have we lost it? Why is it now the idea we raise kids to say your job is to change the world rather than say your job is to preserve the world? Because the economy changes everything anyway. Who's preserving anything? Who's sacrificing things to preserve it? And I do feel when we hear in the West about, we hear about these decolonization of curriculums, for instance, which really is, I think, England being colonized by America's moral panics. It's a classic case of them bringing their preoccupations to us. And so the talk of decolonization is, for me, a colonial act that is not wearing pith helmets. And I just feel that what we're seeing, my point here is that if you look at certainly the Anglosphere, and perhaps France is the same, is that we're seeing an erosion of communities, and I think largely because there's no logic that we care about outside the market. It's super neoliberal now. Things like community, you can't put a value on that. They're intangible values. So now local services, we used to know that after school clubs for kids was always going to be a cost. They're not profitable, but they play an intangible value in the community. But we've stripped them away because you can't justify it in a spreadsheet. No one cares. And so I think what's happened is we've lost a sense that not everything can be quantified, that real qualities are precisely that, they're qualitative. They play a social value that we perhaps cannot put in an Excel spreadsheet. And as long as we have this culture dominated by Excel and nothing, then we're not really going to, then we're going to continue to see the sort of erosion we've seen in sort of Western European countries.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Madame Chagnon, please.
Yes. Yes. Again, to answer about the problem of the numbers of favorable or unfavorable immigration, I think Jan van der Beek from Amsterdam really described immigration very well and said, if it is not, it needs to be chosen, because the difference between a Japanese engineer who comes to Holland for 5 years to work in a company and a sub-Saharan migrant who comes to stay for the rest of his life with his family and dependents and installs himself permanently in Europe is entirely different. One is a contributor to the system, one is an economic contributor to the system, the other one costs tremendous amounts of money to the system, besides talking about the demographic, moral communitary aspects. There is also, I think, Frank, modern immigration, which is successful. I mean, look at how Qatar and Dubai are attracting our young, intelligent people and working for them for a couple of years and developing their countries. There is more foreigners in Qatar than there are Qataris in Qatar, which is something quite astonishing. For our Swiss, our Swiss friend there, why are countries not following Switzerland's example? And I think there we have two issues that are the most important issues. Well, why are European countries not following the example? Is because we can't. We can no longer follow a national migration policy. You must understand that the way the EU is functioning at the moment, we are constrained totally by EU legislation when it comes to migration. So we have nothing to say. And this is only going to get worse with the new Pact for Asylum and Immigration. Just to mention, I was in Lampedusa 2 weeks ago. 11,000 migrants arrived on that island just 2 days before we arrived. There were 0 left when we went to visit that island. First, we were astonished, but then you start thinking, how well is now this process organized to ship migrants from the African continent to Lampedusa, to register them, to transfer them to the mainland, and to send them onwards into the EU. How is it possible? It is totally impossible that 11,000 people are checked, legally checked, seen if they are true migrants or just advantage takers, or terrorists or whatever, in 2 days' time. We saw the facilities. As a conclusion, I would just like to say one thing here. Do not fall into the trap that for the EU, migration is a problem. It is not. They are purposely building a bridge between the African continent and the European continent to facilitate, accelerate migration flows between Africa and the EU. Lampedusa is the example of what is awaiting us in other hotspots, other points in the EU. It was terrifying. For the EU, immigration is not a problem. It is their project. And once you understand that, you know why we don't have a word to say about it as independent nation states, why they don't want people to have a referendum about it, why our elected people who play under the same game as the Commission and the Council of Europe beat about the bush when it comes about giving straight answers. All the pieces fall into shape. Immigration for the EU is not a problem. It is their project, sadly, and it is time that we get a grip on the Commission and on the Council of Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to conclude the conversation, I would like to call onto the stage our head of cultural research, Agnieszka Kolek, to brief you on what it is to come for next MCC Brussels project.
Thank you very much for your attention. I hope not to keep you too long because obviously you would like to continue the conversation over the glass of wine and with nibbles. But I think as we talked at the beginning of our meeting, it's terrifying what's happening in Israel. They're being attacked from the north as we speak. I have friends there. We're going to talk not just about these barbaric attacks and the terrorists that are perpetrating these attacks, but also about the reaction in Western countries, in Europe, America, and Australia. And I hope we will delve deeper into why is that, why the elites are joining this celebration, and what does it mean for us in Europe, and how can we work together with our Jewish friends and Israeli friends to support them. The event is on the 25th of October at 6:30 in Berlaymont here in Brussels. So please join us, join the discussion, and invite your friends. Thank you.
And the best part is yet to come, the dinner. Bon appetit, everyone.